What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. It's day one of a new metagame, which means I am here with a bunch of decks to play. Let's check them out. Starting things off today is Wixie, which was cooked up by Ica, and I had a ton of success with this deck. I would categorize it as my most successful deck since the patch. It's a very straightforward, solid, and powerful deck. It uses Pixie Mobius, which is very good in a world where people are still heavily reliant on Loki. And because of that, you also have the ability to, just by nature of being a Pixie Mobius deck, you want early cost things, you want 1-drops in your deck, you get to run Wiccan just as a sort of backup plan for that. This is not a deck that needs to freak out about Wiccan. He's often very much along for the ride, but what he does do is provide you with extra ways to sort of cheat energy and get free wins out of a deck like this. That is the basic ethos here. I had a lot of fun and a lot of success playing this deck. It is effectively just, you're really just trying to do one of two unfair things, right? Because really you are trying to Pixie Mobius them, and don't be afraid to Pixie when you don't have Mobius. Just do that and see if you pull something off that's ridiculous. I've done that, ended up playing 4 Magnetos in the same game. There's some stuff that this deck lets you do that no other deck will ever let you do. The other thing that I got a lot of value out when playing this list was, of course, Alioth. Not many people were prepared to play around Alioth, especially early Alioths, but generally speaking, this list is very good at taking priority and setting up situations where Alioth, which is normally a fairly unexpected card, might not be so unexpected after this video comes out, but for me, there were a lot of cube robberies thanks to the card Alioth. This is a strong deck that has a baseline mid-range plan with 2 ways to cheat on top of that mid-range plan with Pixie and, of course, Wiccan. Now, when you are not doing either of those things, you're very much just playing some stats. And your stats generally are okay, but not necessarily good enough to keep you in games all of the time when you are not doing those things. You are playing a mid-range deck that is just a little bit worse than the other mid-range decks, except you also go over the top of them when you are able to cheat. The major appeal of this deck for me right now is there are a ton of Loki gamers running around the ladder. Arishem, of course, is still playing it. Arishem's even playing a little more Quinjet now because there's more cards in their deck. You are running into people who are playing actual Quinjet decks, actual Loki decks, Collector, and of course, there are many Loki Bounce gamers out there. As always, I generally enjoy being a Pixie gamer when Loki is a major part of the metagame. For those who want to make absolutely no changes to a pre-patch deck, you can absolutely still play the, what I would consider, probably best iteration of the Clog concept as this current deck stands. This is, of course, the Clog deck that we discussed with Yo Woody, but instead of Hobgoblin, we have Beast, which allows it to be a little bit more, I would say, user-friendly. I'm not going to make a determination on whether Hobgoblin or Beast is better, but Beast covers up your mistakes a lot better than Hobgoblin does, and Hobgoblin demands more out of you in terms of the intestinal fortitude of playing it on the locations where you need to play it in order for it to be worth playing. It demands a lot more out of you. Beast is sort of like training wheels here, but honestly, the deck is still so strong that you are able to do pretty much whatever you want to do basically in every single matchup. Now, the way this deck plays out is it is effectively a combo deck. Your combo is Ajax on turn 5 and then a pretty asinine amount of power on turn 6. Your weakness is Alioth and anything that can interact with your Ajax. Now, for a while, this was not a major issue because there wasn't a ton of Alioth and there wasn't a ton of things that interacted with your Ajax because people were playing a bunch of Cassandra Nova, which necessitated the Arishem decks be all about Shadow King and Shang-Chi, and they weren't really doing anything with your Ajax or anything like that. So that is kind of changing, but there are still a bunch of matchups where you basically get to do this for free, where you have your final turn of like 2 dagger moves, a hazmat, and your dagger's like 24 power, and your Ajax is like 24 power. You're effectively playing like a soft combo deck that also randomly just wins lanes off of clogging your opponent because of the power of the Clog cards in this list. So this deck still exists. I played a few games of this. I was actually running White Queen over Mockingbird. It was good against Sandman and pretty mid everywhere else, but it did some cool stuff for me. But really, realistically, I think when you're building an Arishem deck in the current state of Arishem, you want to lean into the fact that you're going to need to figure out how to win games with your randomly generated cards, which means you're pushed a little bit more towards Mockingbird, you're pushed a little bit more towards, of course, Quinjet, and maybe we'll end up being pushed more towards other card generation. I'm not exactly sure right now. We're also a pretty heavy deck. There's a lot of 6-drops in here. And I think a lot of that for me is just I want the cards that I put in my deck to matter. And those 6-drops really, really matter when you draw them. Because you need like a little bit more impact out of a card you're putting in your deck when you draw it compared to what you did previously. Because now there's 15 cards that randomly start in your deck instead of 12. That said, this felt pretty good. Like, I won't say it felt like exactly as strong as it did previously, but it felt like a reasonable, powerful thing to be doing. It did feel like there were some issues where it was hard for this deck to snap because of the potential for other people to be playing Darkhawk, for other people to be playing Cassandra Nova. And we ended up going away from Shadow King again because at a certain point, it's like that is only there for Cassandra Nova. And when we have so much crap in our deck, it's just hard to justify. Of course, we still have the nut draw of Loki on turn 2, but that is, a notable amount less likely. So we often end up having to piece together our win conditions based on what the game decides to give us. Sometimes that's really good, sometimes that's really bad. But to me, it felt like Arishem was still pretty strong and just needed to be built in such a way that there were less wasted draws in our own deck, more high-impact cards coming out of our deck. Assuming people catch on to Arishem being still functional, it might be a good idea to start up with some Thena Hawk gaming. One of the notable inclusions here is, of course, Killmonger. You'll see a couple Killmongers here. I realize people will look at this and think, oh, they're running Killmonger for Zoo. That's honestly not what it is. Killmonger is here for like the bounce sub-theme decks. There are several decks that are leveraging what I would describe as like roughly the same core of Kate Bishop and Beast and not necessarily Falcon, but like the Hood and Viper and all of this stuff that does in some way involve some weakness to Killmonger a decent amount of the time, whether that be blowing up the 1-drops they send over to you, the Acid Arrow and the Hood, or blowing up their 1/6s. The point of playing a Killmonger in a deck like this is that it is unexpected. People are not playing around Killmonger in this list. They are playing around the normal stuff that they might have. Killmonger can also create more space for your Juggernaut to do work, but mostly this deck should be fairly familiar to anyone really watching. This is a deck that is going to play Thena and then is going to play 2 cards a turn, and then sometimes on turn 5, instead of playing 2 cards a turn, it'll play a big 5-drop, and then it'll play Mystique, and then it'll play a 3-drop that wins a lane, whether that be Juggernaut or Cosmo or Killmonger. This is a familiar story to everyone who's played this game for a little bit, and it is, in my opinion, the hardest counter to Arishem. Typically, the move builds have done better in what we'll describe as the pseudo mirror, where the move Thena decks have ended up coming out on top of the Darkhawk Thena decks, because the Darkhawk Thena decks are just a little bit more finicky, right? Like, you end up in weird spots. One of the things that makes this deck less finicky that I actually enjoy, there's no Mystique in it. And I genuinely love that, because I am not a fan of playing Mystique in these decks. It is such a card that, like, it's only good in certain situations, and when you're in those situations, it's always very telegraphed. The one thing that I would like to get in this deck, however, is Hope Summers, because I think she helps even out the curve in this list a lot better. Speaking of randomly including Killmonger in decks, even when it doesn't necessarily make the most sense, this is a list that has been championed by Big Baby and by Butt, both of whom are in the top 10 right now, with a list that looks a lot like this, if not exactly like this, depending on what they're doing during the day. Now, this list is very similar to the Wixie list. It's leveraging similar stuff with less explosion, more baseline, straightforward power, and is generally trying to take advantage of the fact that there has been a notable downtick in decks that are actually able to deal with Annihilus stuff. Now, that's not always true, but there are certainly matchups where Annihilus is just going to be an absolute house the way that he used to be. I personally had more success with the Wixie build if I were to play a Sersi deck. I enjoyed that one more because of the positioning that it has, being able to be a Mobius deck into a metagame where people are playing Loki felt very powerful to me. But I also understand why just taking this shell and saying, I'm going to tech a good mid-range deck for the meta, and that's how we're going to approach this, is a totally valid, totally viable, and totally functional way to approach this metagame. I think it's pretty damn solid. This is a good deck that has pedigree going back to the Annihilus's release, honestly. And it has been a little bit overshadowed recently due to Thena sort of being a better mid-range deck. It's possible that this nerf does make it a little bit more able to compete with more of the draws out of the Thena decks, which to me do feel kind of clunky. It's going to be a little bit before we figure out what the right Thena deck for the metagame is, whereas this deck I think is already extremely close to being the correct 12. And there is something to be said about having a polished list and being able to play that polished list early in a metagame against other unpolished lists after a nerf. This is a negative list cooked up by Dubois, and you might notice that there is a Loki in it and get really mad at me. However, there are some unique and fun things going on here that your opponents might not know about. The way this list works is you either play negative or Loki. If you play Loki, Jane Foster will draw your opponent's 1-cost cards out of the deck as zeros. So against certain decks, you are going to be getting a lot of free power. Hello, Rocket Raccoon. Hello, every card in Bounce. You're going to be getting a lot of good stuff off of that Jane Foster. Now, the other thing this deck has going for it is a line against Sandman that many other decks do not. Being able to play Wong into Sage, into Taskmaster the Sage, is actually the way you have to play against a deck like Sandman, which is otherwise very, very good against you. However, again, notable weakness to the card Mobius M. Mobius. Part of why I like the Wixie deck is when decks like this are on the upswing, it is able to get wholly, entirely punished by the card Mobius. And of course, this is a deck that relies on discounts both ways. Whether you are Lokiing, whether you are Mr. Negativing, both of those things end up sort of face up dead to Mobius. However, this is a deck that is the deck you remember. This is classic Mr. Negative. You are doing Mr. Negative things. Your goal is to play one of your broken cards that changes your deck into something weird into Jane Foster, and then just power straight on through them. This should be a pretty straightforward deck for anyone who's familiar with Mr. Negative, and I do think the discovery or the addition of Loki and Jane in here is a unique and powerful upgrade to what was already a playable deck. I'm interested to see where this ends up going in the future. One of the things I like about when Mr. Negative is good is how easy it is to tech against. And so I think that it's always, when Mr. Negative is actually able to be competitive, it pushes certain decks out and creates space for other decks and allows the metagame to flow. And we haven't really had a metagame that actually flows in a while because of Arishem stuff, Thena stuff, just sort of powering everything else out. I'm excited to see if this deck can actually keep up now that that stuff has been toned down a little. I have multiple people who I generally trust saying that this deck is actually very good. It's a Loki Bounce deck that I personally have had far less success with than many of the other decks on this list. However, the current ranked 2 player is playing it. Several of my other friends are willing to vouch for it. So it is worth discussing because you will absolutely 100% see this deck. One of the things that I think is important to understand about this deck is it is a factory of 50-50s. It feels like every time I play this, if I guess correctly what my opponent is going to do, I am going to win the game. I am going to do something incredible. If I guess incorrectly, if I get a read right, or I get a read wrong, I should say, it ends up being far more problematic for this deck. The margins are very thin. It does not feel like a deck that just wins every matchup unless you do everything right. And it is the kind of deck that if you do everything right, does actually feel unbeatable. But you have to do everything right. And not just in hindsight, you have to be like, okay, I am going to save this Falcon because I think my opponent is going to try to clog up this lane because I know that they're going to send that Hood over. I'm going to want to pick that up, and that means I need to plan ahead so that I am able to actually have room in my hand to pick up my stuff and also that thing and unclog my lane. And that's just like one thing of like 10 million that you have to think of in this deck. I also was pretty aggressively snapping Loki. It did not serve me well because the deck is sort of self-contained some of the time. I'm not sure if that's like just bad luck or anything, but it did feel like it was worth mentioning that when I played this deck, I was aggressively snapping Loki, and it did feel like I was losing some of those games, and it maybe isn't the snap condition that I thought it was. If you found the Loki deck a little bit too confusing and weird and skill testing, which honestly I kind of do, it's entirely possible that you might have better results with just Normie Bounce. This is the Gnome Plays list, and it's a very solid, straightforward, and powerful deck. There are a lot less Sandman gamers. I played against one Sandman gamer in like 5 hours, and I played against him with Arishem and just lost. So I don't really know if Sandman is really the move right now. In a world where there are less Sandman gamers, this deck obviously gets a pretty big boost. Although I do think that people sort of overstate how bad of a matchup Sandman is for this. It's obviously not something we want to see a ton of, right? The basic premise of a deck like this is you get to pick and choose and distribute your power the way you want to distribute it. The other thing, of course, is this deck is leveraging what I like to call the soft Clog core. Kate Bishop, White Widow, Beast, Viper, and the Hood. That's like effectively a soft Clog that you get going, just kind of for free. You include those cards because they're good, but you also, that core, you see it in the Loki deck some of the time as well. It just shows up a lot of places, and you kind of get it for free because you're doing this for free. You're not really paying a cost other than hand size management to get potentially like turn 4 Clogs off on your opponent in a deck that has a lot of power output generally. This is just your classic good Marvel Snap deck. The main thing you're going to want to focus on is on the final turn of the game, where is your opponent going to put power? What is that power going to look like? Can you beat cards like Goliath? What do you have to do to make things happen? This is a deck that is entirely focused on power distribution on turn 6, and its main competitive advantage is that it is able to distribute that power after seeing what the board looks like. So this is a deck that really wants you to take advantage of the available information. Example of available information, I just hit the mic for the 3rd time this video. I'm very, very sorry. I'm gonna leave it in though. So this list wants you to distribute your power in ways that your opponent might not expect, wants you to distribute your power in ways that your opponent might not be able to possibly beat. And so it benefits very heavily from you knowing what your opponent is actually trying to do. When you play a deck like this, you need to pay attention to what your opponent is doing and figure out what their turn 6 looks like so you can model your turn 6 on beating it. I have been kind of obliterated by Wong decks randomly. Like, this deck is just good still. Just randomly beats the crap out of stuff. It was in a bad spot when a lot of people were playing, you know, like Juggernaut style Cosmo kind of inclusions. I like the Sizer deck in there with their Thena stuff. And even when they weren't playing like both Cosmo and Juggernaut, you were seeing a lot of decks that were like, okay, I'm going to have, you know, Shadow King in here. I've got abilities like Magneto sometimes running around. Like, there were a lot more things that disrupted this deck in previous metagames, and now I think there's honestly a lot less. I cut Shadow King from Arishem, for one thing, that's notable. And Cosmo's in one of my decks, Juggernaut's in one of my decks, but not really any more than that. And so they aren't really hitting the same splash damage, because Juggernaut was a very common inclusion in tons of Thena decks, and now it's kind of a little bit more iffy as to whether or not there is a like dedicated Thena deck that we know is good right now. It's very early. And so for that reason, I think that this deck just has an opportunity to run people over. There's a lot of decks on this list that just kind of can't beat what this deck does as its little combo. And when the more decks that this deck has free wins into, the better off it is. Like, it's just, you just get a lot of free wins with a deck like this. You just have Wong and are able to snap it, and you recognize pretty early that they're not playing one of the decks that has interaction for you. And then you beat the crap out of them because that's what this deck does. And it goes tall as hell, and it does strong things, and I think this, of all decks in the entire video, is the one that I should have to spend the absolute least time explaining. People who have been playing White Tiger Odin since Pool 1, you all kind of get what's going on here. One tip I do have for you is, I guess these are 2 tips, right? Tip number 1, make sure you keep a move card in the lane that you are wonging with, right? That's really important. People are also going to ask, what is Echo here for? That's so you can be immune to Cosmo. But you're going to want to keep a move card in the Wong lane because of the amount of Clog that your opponents are able to dump onto you. And that is a pretty key thing to keep like in mind, because one of the ways this deck can lose and get its snaps flipped on it is you end up in a situation where your Wong just gets clogged up and you cry yourself to sleep and you can't do anything about it, and then you lose the game. Very easy to lose like that. Please try to avoid it. If you're looking for just a fair deck that does points, Silver Surfer is a completely reasonable option for you. There are a couple options under fair deck that does points without really a lot of interaction. It's going to be this and Zoo that really sort of show up over and over again. The deck likes doing points. It is extremely straightforward at doing points. If you want to have a little bit of interaction in there, get a Red Guardian in there. It's really not that hard. This deck is kind of all about the number it puts on the board. And when you focus on that number, you end up in a good spot a lot of the time. One of the interesting things about this deck is how it has an interesting, awkward matchup into Loki. Old Loki, it seemed like it was actually pretty good into, right? Like, this was a deck where it's like, if they didn't get the exact stuff, they might not have enough space on the board to do what they need to do with the threes. New Loki, A, is a 3-cost, and B, plays, it feels like, more 3-costs in a real way. Loki, the card, I think a little bit worse into Silver Surfer, but Loki, the deck, like the decks people are playing with Loki, when I've been playing Loki, I felt good into Silver Surfer. That said, a lot of it is just down to what they draw. They only have a few draws, and if they don't draw the stuff that really matters, you're going to be able to outpoint them with this deck. And I do think that's worth talking about. The issue is, I'm not sure there's a super compelling reason to play this beyond I like having a Killmonger deck that is able to also do points. That has always sort of been the case for Silver Surfer, and it's definitely not a bad deck. It's not really something I would say is like the top of the top tier. It's a perfectly functional, good, I guess the way I would describe it is like it's like a 55% win rate deck. Maybe that's too high, but it's like a solid B tier, good deck. Nothing wrong with it. Just play it, get your points done, Killmonger the crap out of them, do what you gotta do. Last up is Zoo, which is still a deck and still does many of the same things Silver Surfer does, but the numbers that it creates are much, maybe not much, but they're reasonably larger, right? And the downside for that is they're also reasonably much more easy to interact with. I think Zoo is a sort of, you must be this tall to ride kind of deck, where it's like, you can absolutely just lose to this deck out of basically any deck. Like, there are so many decks where it's like, if you stumble, Zoo will run you over, because Zoo's main advantage is like, generally, it is going to do the thing that it wants to do. If you like a deck that is built for consistency, Zoo is that deck. There are very few games where you're just like, I guess I didn't do it. And part of that is that Zoo has sort of smoothed out the curve. There are good 2-drops in there. Hawkeye is really helping you. You are able to make sure you are using all your energy basically every turn. Marvel Boy is an incredibly powerful card that is putting a lot of points on the board. You curve out, you do your thing, your numbers are really big. That's Zoo. What you don't have is a meaningful way to interact with anyone ever. You interact with people the way a kindergartner interacts with people, by addition. You count. That's it. Your interaction is, I'm going taller than you. That's it. Pure Marvel Snap right there. All right, y'all. Thank you for making it through that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I've been really impressed with the reception to these day one decks videos, so I put a little more into this one. Trying to get more decks in here, talk to more of my high-level friends, played more on the first stream. So hopefully you enjoyed this one even more. Thank you so much for making it through. I do have one final note. People are going to ask, Cam, did you have any Thanos decks? I do not see a ton of hope for Thanos. I will see about it if someone that gets to proof of concept with it. My instinct is I don't think it's very good, but we will have to sort of see and let it develop. I do not have anything for Thanos right now. I do know that Crazy, who is a very good player, constantly in the top 10, loves Thanos, tried new Thanos and came away from it thinking that it still sucked. And I feel like if the Thanos one-tricks are telling me it's not that good, then I'm not going to invest in it until someone tells me otherwise. That's sort of where I'm at with Thanos right now. It's like, if someone is able to convince me, I'll believe them, but early signs are not great, and I didn't want to put something on the list that I didn't feel confident in. So that's why there's no Thanos here. As always, though, thank you so much for being phenomenal, because you are. I, on the other hand, am KM Best, and I will see you in the next one.